and welcome to Building One Community's 6th Annual Colloquium. So we're very, very excited to have you here. For those of you who do not know me, I am Anca Badurina, the Executive Director of Building One Community, and it is my pleasure to present this evening's program to you. I have some exciting news to share with you about four particular programs of B1C, our Immigration Legal Services program, our English language program, Family and Individual Services, and finally about the work that we're doing about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, and given the topic tonight, I am going to start with Immigration Legal Services, right? This program, for those of you who might not know, was created in 2016, and it started to provide affordable and pro bono legal services to low-income immigrants and their families, so they could understand their rights and... Can you hear me better now? Oh, now we're talking. Doesn't come any closer, but I hope that's better, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good. So I was saying that the program actually started in 2016, and the idea was to really provide pro bono and affordable, low-cost legal services to our immigrant community in Stanford. The ILS staff and volunteers, we have some here tonight, of this program is led by attorney Adriana Podesta, and now serve more than 600 families and individuals each year, resulting in many, many positive outcomes like family reunification, citizenship, and asylum. So, and I have to say that we are very excited because recently we added a removal defense practice, and for which, again, we are very, very thrilled, and I'm going to explain you why. Fairfield County, in general, it's a very diverse immigrant community, and it's not only diverse in the sense of where our folks are coming from, but it's also diverse in the sense of the immigration status that they hold. So many of our families that come to B1C, they hold mixed or blended. They are what we call actually mixed or blended families, which means that we might have a spouse that is a green card holder, but maybe the other spouse is an undocumented immigrant, and they have one or two kids who are American citizens. And that's what we see very often. Some of these undocumented immigrants are actually in removal proceedings at the Hartford Immigration Court and facing possible deportation. Many of them have fled violence and persecution from their home countries, and they're here because this is a safe harbor for them and for their families as well. And I don't know if you know, but in Fairfield County, there are an estimate of about 5,000. I'm going to hold the thing if I can. There you go. There are about 5,000 individuals in removal proceedings. Unfortunately, many of these immigrants, it's about half of them cannot afford a lawyer to support their cases. Our immigration laws are some of the most complex, and it is nearly impossible for an individual to go pro se and represent himself, navigate the whole system on their own. So, and a study of cases in the New York Immigration Court some years ago realized that immigrants, when they find themselves representing themselves, they are 12 times less likely to actually win those cases. So what I'm talking is that if I were to defend myself and I have a very good case, maybe my chances are about 4%, but if I have legal representation, my chances can go up to 48% or so. So that's really why we're so excited to have to be adding a removal defense practice to our immigration legal services. The lead attorneys for this practice is Jen Williams, and she and Adriana will be joining the conversation tonight. We're also welcoming two recent law graduates to our team, Paola Idrobo and Lauren Hughes, who will be serving as legal fellows for the next 2 years at B1C. And I also wanted to share that given the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, I'd like to share that We are currently supporting and working on a case of a longtime resident, Connecticut resident, who is seeking humanitarian parole for 22 of his family members back in Afghanistan. And our team is trying to support the families to come to the United States because of the imminent risk of harm by the Taliban. We also plan to provide legal assistance to another 7 families that were referred to us by CIRI, the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. And beyond the legal services that we provide, we're also offering English language classes and job training that will help these families advance integration into our larger community. Which brings me to the next program that I wanted to share with you about, which is our English language program. English is the most fundamental skills that allows an immigrant to really integrate into our society. B1C's English classes our program is big and is vibrant, and I know some of you here tonight are volunteers of that program, and you experience that energy firsthand, right? Or if you are not, when you come to our centers and classes are taking place, the energy is palpable, lots of people wanting to learn and lots of volunteers wanting to support that learning. So we are very happy that we just hired not long ago Gretchen Anderson, who is an English language or certified English language instructor, and who will be assisting our volunteers with training, directing students' assessments and reassessments, and also reevaluating and revamping our curriculum as well. So that's a lot of exciting for us because we think that these changes will provide a more consistent experience for our learners. At the same time, it will help our volunteers deliver instruction that is more focused and coordinated. So super excited in that field as well. And I'm going to move on to our Family and Individual Services program. This is the program that helps new arrivals with the nuts and bolts of functioning in our society. We're all good. It's a salute. So imagine that you just arrived to a country where you don't know the language and you have to deal with things like getting your driver license and registering your kids to the school and also getting your healthcare sorted out. And most of the people that you're dealing with don't speak your own language, right? So this is hard, day in, day out. So our Family Individual Services program, what it does is precisely support these families reach these resources. This program is actually undergoing its second pivot, if you will, in the last couple of years. The first pivot was to provide emergency assistance to people affected by the pandemic. From a B1C participant that you might recall who got severe COVID while she was pregnant, to the thousands of people that we've been supporting with emergency assistance because they lost their jobs, to the 1,300 people we assisted in getting vaccinated either at B1C or Stanford Hospital. So we spent most of the past year and a half in emergency mode, if you will. But now we're happy that we're pivoting again. And Loreli Peche, who used to work for our Power Organizing program, is now our new director of Family and Individual Services. In addition to continuing the traditional services that this particular department does, Loreli will be expanding the department services for children and their parents in the school system. The pandemic has not been kind to children of immigrant families, as they struggle to adapt to the new technologies of learning remotely, for example. The achievement gap between the immigrants and native-born families is just widening. B1C, through this program in particular, will be advocating for families in the schools and will be teaching parents to advocate for themselves and their children, and will be strengthening our after-school programs, and much, much more. So we're very excited with that second pivot that has nothing to do with the pandemic somehow. And finally, I wanted to share that we're super proud of the work that we have been doing around racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We actually started in January 2020, training our staff on diversity issues, and we wanted to learn what are the implications of racism in the work that we at B1C actually do. We hosted a couple of trainings, then the pandemic started and we put kind of like a hold. But by May, the social unrest resulting from George Floyd's killing made our original intention to understand racism even more urgent. So by June, we joined forces with a number of organizations and it started to quickly form what it has been called Stanford Stance Against Racism Initiative. We drafted a call to action statement asking for citywide immediate action on an issue that has been for too long ignored. And since then, I am happy to report that B1C has engaged its boards of directors and staff in several training opportunities to raise awareness and to also create concrete action plans. So our goal in the end is to be an active organization addressing systemic racism and racial issues that affect our community day in and day out. And today we're also proud to say that we're well in our way to actually not only do it with our boards and staff, but also engage our volunteers and our participants in this journey. And next week on the 18th, we are kicking off an art show, a BIPOC art show, and BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Colors. It's going to be hosted at B1C. You will be receiving invitations, so I hope to see you there. And that's what I wanted to share about our racial work. And I'd like to end by sharing that tomorrow is actually the kickoff of Welcoming Week. It's a nationwide celebration of the community of neighbors that we can actually be. And this year, the topic is Belonging Begins with Us. In our everyday work at B1C, we strive to make Stanford a welcoming place for all. Our goal is to bring together immigrants, refugees, and long-time residents to build strong connections and to achieve collective prosperity. So by acknowledging belonging begins with us, B1C makes an open call to invite everyone to join the welcoming movement and support a community where everyone feels that they belong. So please do follow us on social media, and we're going to be showing there how we're going to be celebrating Welcoming Week. Before I actually introduce our panelists that I know you're waiting for, let me just say a big, big thank you to our events committee. Our colloquium chair, Sarita Hanley, that I saw she was somewhere here. Thank you. She's hiding somewhere, but I saw her before. And our sponsorship chair, Marianne Khan, who couldn't be here tonight, but they have been, both of them, beyond rock stars, really. And we're incredibly grateful for making tonight a reality. And now, yes, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panel. Allen Orr, who is sitting in the middle, is founder of Orr Immigration Law Firm PC in DC. Allen specializes in US and global immigration. He's a speaker on emerging business immigration issues, a senior editor of the Immigration and National Law Handbook, and president of the AILA, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He received the 2009 Miss Guillon Lawyer Award for contributions in immigration law. He's listed in the international who's who of corporate immigration lawyers, and is a graduate of Howard University's School of Law. Thank you, Allen, for being here tonight. Doug Penn of Law Office of Douglas Penn, LLC, and he's actually a B1C board member, practices immigration and naturalization law. He frequently speaks at immigration law conferences at the state and national levels. Mr. Penn has been named in Best Lawyers in America and by Martin Hubble as Distinguished in Immigration and Naturalization Law. He is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, past chair of its Connecticut chapter, and serves on AILA national committees. He graduated from the University of Denver, the BA, MA, and JD. Welcome back. And finally, Lucas Codognolla. Lucas actually came to the United States with his family at age 9, and he immigrated to the United States from Brazil. He's a recognized and documented leader in the immigrant youth movement. Mr. Codognolla was executive director of Connecticut Students for a Dream, C4D, a youth-led network fighting for the rights of undocumented youth. Under his leadership, C4D won advocacy campaigns resulting in educational equity policy change at institutional and legislative levels. He's the senior manager of partnerships and advocacy at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and was board vice chair of United We Dream. So thank you, Lucas. So Doug, the floor is all yours.
Okay. All right. So tonight's going to be a conversation about immigration law and policy. We want you to be able to ask questions, but we ask that you hold them until the end. There are pads of paper on your chairs. If you have questions, please write down the questions. We will collect them and read them and hopefully be able to answer them at the end. Immigration tends to be something that is low on our priorities until the news happens, and then that is the key point. So we're going to use the news that's going on now as our entry point. So, Alan, we're going to kind of deal with it each in part, but let's start with what's going on with the people coming from Afghanistan.
Sure. So first, I want to thank you for having me here. I'm part of your community now. I'm here part-time in Stamford, Connecticut. I think the most important thing to recognize tonight is that you are the people, you're the helpers. And that's what I sort of talk about at the American Immigration Law Association, in the very nature of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, that when something happens, to look for the helpers. And you are those helpers that are coming to help people that may or may not know, and I appreciate that, and they appreciate it as well. You could be changing someone's life, which is what I do every day in my practice. Part of our problem inside of the Beltway of DC, where I also live part-time, is sort of the struggle of understanding that these are people and not things. These are realities that can't wait, and these are not political tools. And so the government is asking for $30 million to help meet the need right now in sort of a continual spending bill for these refugees. And the problem with that is that they're really not solving the problem, right? They're not saying, this is what your future is. They're saying, here's just a step on the ladder, and it's just the first step. And that's where the bigger conversation is happening right now around immigration reform. And the reason that we need immigration reform is because we haven't reformed the immigration system since the 80s. So we keep saying there are more people getting in line trying to go through the same door. And what we need to do is make more doors. And it's a very real possibility, easy thing to do. It's been done under both administrations. I was a Ronald Reagan Republican at the time who expanded immigration, moved away from that into a new light. And all the different facets of the political pool have had problems. And what we see right now is that instead of solving something, they're using it as a political ball to sort of hold things back. And that's why you're sort of seeing right now that even the way the Democrats are trying to push through reconciliation to just deal with the small population of people, right? When you start talking about individuals that are DACA recipients who came as minors who had no willful sort of violation of saying everybody agrees, 80% of America agrees that they should have some sort of permanent way to citizenship, and you've been dealing with that for 10 years, that's not a problem. That is something that you're making a consideration and a tool and a pawn in this sort of arena. And while I'm in Stamford, which is great to know is, and there's such a large Haitian population, that I want us to remember that there is no sort of good immigrant, right? All immigrants are good, all people have value. And that's what I saw tonight when I walked in here. Everybody said hello and welcome, and this is who I am, right? And you didn't ask me if I had a green card, if I was documented, what I did, right? You just said hello. And that's part of what the Welcoming Week is about, and that's part of what immigration is about, not sort of saying, what is this, what is that? Sort of welcoming as a family and saying, let's deal with that. And I think you can't look at the Afghanistan issue and forget about the Haitian issue that has existed for a very long time. And I'm of Haitian descent, I have no problem saying that, as well as forgetting the Carumians and the people at the southern border. One of the problems that we have in America is that we want to say the people coming from Afghanistan, poor women and children, horrible lifestyle. But then when we look at the southern border and we look at the same women and children from a different area of the world, we say, oh, those are bad people. They're coming to do horrible things. Why do we make those assessments? How can we make those assessments when we don't really know those individuals? And that's part of the dilemma that we have right now in the political pool. And so what is happening inside of DC is that stagnation that's been going on for a very long time. And since that stagnation is going on, what we're seeing is exactly what's happening here in Stanford. Local communities are stepping up and saying, we're not putting up with this anymore. The first thing that I think is important to do is to vote the right people in office who are willing to do something, willing to make the change. But when the people won't do the change, it's also important for the communities to step up and say, we're going to help these individuals get the justice that we provide under our Constitution, right? Because that's really what it's about. We're not saying everybody gets to stay. We're not saying everybody has relief under the INA, but what we're saying is you get justice, you get a lawyer, you get an opportunity to be heard, and you don't have to wait a long time. Many individuals who are in the immigration process right now are waiting around 2 years to get a maybe, right? I can get a bachelor's degree in 2 years, almost a law degree in 2 years. So think about that. If someone were to tell you that you had 2 years to get something because they were doing some extreme vetting, which is like being a little bit pregnant, like are you either pregnant or not? So what's the extreme part of the vetting? Is there something extra that you need to sort of clear that process? It's just words to make you feel good. It's the concept you have when you go to the airport and you see there's 1,000 people in line and waiting makes them feel as if they've done a good job, when in fact waiting is the exact opposite of making them see they did a good job, right? And so that's where we are at the face. There's backlogs everywhere, and part of it's due to COVID, and we didn't create COVID, but you think if you were, the issue that I say most about when you talk about UCIS, the issue is it's not about money. I think money would help, but it's about management. Right? Because if you weren't able to see people in person, you could have processed the cases, right? And what happens to me a lot of times is the same thing that happens when you're a young adult. You think if I make more money, that's going to solve my problem. But your problem isn't the money. Your problem is the money management and the sort of abusing it. And that's the problem we're faced with inside the Beltway right now.
Okay, sounds good. Which actually brings me to Lucas. Is it okay if I talk a little bit about your history? Sure. Like 2 seconds? So Lucas has DACA. And that's actually how he and I met 12 years, well, no, not 12 years ago, 9 years ago now.
Right.
And so I do kind of want to touch base when we're talking about the line, because that's something that you've experienced.
Right.
And so kind of, tell us about that line. What does that look like? And is it exist for everyone, or is it just some people?
Sure, thank you. And I'd like to thank Building One Community for the invitation. I originally from Brazil. I grew up here in Stanford, down the street from Building One Community, and I use the services at Building One at B1C. My parents use the services at Building 1C, so it's great to be back and contribute in this manner. But yeah, as Doug said, I am part of a mixed status family, and you heard Anka talking a little bit about this. And so my parents have green cards, they're permanent residents. I have 2 siblings that are citizens, and I am the only undocumented person in my family who has DACA. So I have deferred action for childhood arrivals. I'm a recipient. And I'm in this process of every 2 years have to renew DACA. And I was just, impacted by the backlogs this year, where I applied for during the normal time frame, and my work authorization expired. And so I had to work with Senator Murphy's office, and I called Doug for support as well, in trying to figure out how can we expedite the processing of my work authorization so that I'm able to work. And so I had to be placed on leave at my current job in order for my paperwork to be processed. And so this is these backlogs, these lines. The reason why I wasn't able to be included in my family's petition was because of my age. At the time in which my parents were able to get their permanent residency, I was over the age of 21. And so I do have a petition with them, but it's taken obviously long. And these lines have taken long. And you think about it's hard for sort of a person who's not engaged in, or sort of who's not living, right, as part of these lines, to understand how cumbersome it is to apply and wait years and years and years, as Allen said, for a maybe. And that has been sort of the reality for me in my situation, but also for many families that B1C sees every day and families that are living here in Fairfield County.
Yeah, one of the things to talk about, I have clients who I have represented for 20 years. And that's not unheard of. It's not unreasonable. You get to, I had a client who, during the course of her case, she lives down here, her child went from being middle school to mid-20s and married. So, these lines are real. And these are the people who, quote unquote, are lucky that they actually have a line.
Right.
And Alan will tell you this, and Lucas would tell you this too. If we were talking to a room full of immigrants of about this size, if 10 of you had a viable immigration case, that's actually pretty good. So that's kind of the reality that we're looking at here. So that's kind of the, I guess let me go back to another thing I wanted to touch base with you, Lucas. Mm-hmm. So the immigrants who are coming here, and by here I mean specifically to Stanford, what's the experience that they have, or what do you think they get here? When they get here, Alan mentioned that they're kind of given some money and then said, okay, you've got 3 months to fend for yourself, 3 months and then you're on your own. How does that feel? How does that, are we welcoming as a community in Stanford to that?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And Stanford is so diverse, and Stanford is, and it's changed a lot during the last few decades, as you can see. And I think it's amazing to see B1C becoming a staple of what welcoming looks like for this community. You hear a lot of different stories, but there's common themes in the stories of immigrant families that come to this community looking for better opportunities, looking for the ability to work and provide for their families, not just their nuclear families here, but their families back in their home countries. You see a lot of families that are coming here with small children who want better education for their children. In my family, my parents never graduated high school. So I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, graduate college. And I talk to my parents now as an adult, really trying to understand the reasons why they came to this country was because of better education and to get out of poverty in Brazil. And they took a risk and sacrificed a lot for them to come here as tourists and for us to overstay our visa and for them to be undocumented for nearly 15 years here. And so you see a lot of immigrants coming here, and the beauty is in the immigrant community is the community that they create amongst themselves. And so the importance of churches, the importance of community members and social clubs and restaurants, ethnic restaurants in our communities. And when immigrants come into our communities and they find these places, they find folks that are or families that are having similar experiences as them, they begin to form communities and support one another. And it's hard. It's hard for them to navigate the systems here to matriculate their kids into school, in the school systems, to find support. Even in my family, there have been times where we needed to call the police and we were scared to call the police or engage with different agencies, municipal agencies, because we were scared to share our status over the years. And now Stanford has become such a welcoming city that it's important for us to have translation services, for us to have organizations like Building One Community that are providing the service, but also empowering the immigrants themselves to understand the systems, to be engaged in their communities and understand how to ask for support. And so I think it's really crucial for us to keep in mind of how do we create welcoming, not just places, right, physical places like Building One Community and other organizations, but actually how do we look at our systems and make sure that they're not discriminating against immigrants, right? In registering kids to school and getting a permit to go to the parks here in Stanford or in any community. It's simple things that maybe for you all as sort of U.S. citizens you don't think about.
It is basically traffic court in the sense that the problem with the current court system is it's not independent. So the attorney, the officer, and the judge all answer to the same boss. And that's a problem in getting justice, as well as they were graded and may still be graded on sort of a sliding scale with regards to how many cases they actually adjudicate without giving ample time to each individual person. In addition to that structural problem, the bench is made up of former police officers, in a sense, ICE officers, ICE lawyers, people who grew up in a system where deportation was the job, right? So if your job is to deport people and now all of a sudden you're made a judge, how liberal are you really going to be in fair and distributing justice? So that's just the baseline problem. So what AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the American Bar Association are sort of pulling for is to say, pull those judges out of that system, make them an independent court system so that they don't answer to the same person, just like every other system that Americans sort of answer to, and let everybody get justice independently.
Really good job. I actually expected 30 words was just a joke. You can go longer. No. Yeah, I think sometimes I've heard it described as kangaroo court, because the rules are set up for the government to win. All the players, except for the respondent, the person who's fighting deportation, are on the same side, and they talk. The idea of you don't have ex parte communications, not in immigration court. And it's civil, which means not criminal, which means no right to counsel. And I want you guys, there's actually, last week tonight, several years ago, had a video on immigration court. And on that, they included a transcript of a judge working with an unrepresented immigrant. I mention this because that Judge Carte, at the time of the video, he was in Texas. When I first moved here in 1999, he was the immigration judge in Hartford. So in his defense, he is trying to explain immigration law to the respondent and trying to give the respondent a chance to kind of understand what's going on. The girl was 5. 5, as in 5 years old. Now, she was actually pretty self-possessed. She wasn't crying. She wasn't upset. You could see, though, she was not understanding what was going on. There's no right to counsel in immigration court. It's a civil matter. So it's not criminal. That's why we don't call it jails when we detain them. They're in detention facilities. And they can stay in detention facilities for a fairly long time. And I've heard even Secretary Mayorkas, who's the current Secretary of Homeland Security, when pressed on saying, do we need to detain people? He said, well, I will tell you, I've never met a detained case that I don't think needs to be detained. So, that's kind of, when we talk about justice, that's what we're talking about. That's how we deal with people. Which then brings me to my question for Lucas. So, how does that sound to you? I mean, does immigration court sound like it's not criminal court? Does it?
It definitely doesn't. And another thing that's important to note is that a lot of the detention centers are privately owned. So these are private prisons that are profiting from having immigrants detained. And so it is a money-making machine. Deportation is a money-making machine. And so there are people that are profiting, companies, corporations that are profiting off of the deportation of people. And so this machine that we see, it is about money. It is about sort of influence in politics. And it is about sort of the systemic barriers to getting justice. And so we hear a lot of scary experiences of immigrants that are doing all of the things that they can do and are gathering their documents and everything that they can to go up to Hartford to plead their case, and they don't leave the building and they're detained and families are separated. We see families, pregnant women that go and get ankle bracelets, monitors, monitoring devices attached to their ankles, and they stay with that device for years at a time as their court cases are coming to fruition, et cetera. And so this has a very, very, very visceral, sort of tangible impact in immigrants. And it causes fear, it causes confusion, and as Doug said, immigrants don't have the right to counsel. And so you see families that will go above and beyond to make so many sacrifices in order to get minimal sort of funds to be able to consult at least an attorney to see what can they do in their case and how they should even approach the court system.
Well, I should also say this one other thing about the management of the court system. So if you were to go to immigration court today for a master calendar hearing, which is when you get your date for your real court date, depending on where you are, you could possibly get a date in 2025. So the expectation that someone would come in today and then stay in communication with the court system for that long time, depending on how old you are and what resources you may have, is quite extravagant. And while I think, I'm of the belief that everyone doesn't get to stay, one of the ways that the courts have been re-engineered is first in, first out. So let's say if you had an asylum case that was filed before 2017, you could be waiting even longer than someone who had a case filed recently, because the concept was we want to get rid of the ones who are sort of coming through before. And so what that sort of says to, and I'm just going to say this, I love an accountant, right? But a bean counter is that you sort of set up these tent courts and you run people through. And the problem, anybody who thinks of that as justice, I mean, you just couldn't imagine thinking of your whole life experience before someone in 5 minutes and sort of determining to send people back out of the country after having a concept to talk to them for 5 minutes when they may not even trust you. So someone who's fleeing a flawed government to come to our government asking for help has that issue. And one of the things that I want you to think about, because I do think about these parities because I live a lot in the diversity and inclusion spaces, the Afghanistanis that were helping us before, we're bringing them here and we're saying, you're refugees, come in, we're going to set you up in these military, we're going to feed you, give you school. The kids that are at the southern border who have come from the same place or who've come from the continent of Africa, we're saying, oh, you're criminals, we're going to put you in detention centers and we're going to treat you that way. So what is the determination between those two groups of people? It's just someone saying it, right? Because you're vetting both group of people, but the way you're treating them is very different. And these prisons are super important. And from me, because I live in that sort of libertarian Republican world, we're paying for that, right? And so when we start thinking about the best way for a taxpayer to do their money, it'd be better for us as a taxpayer to say, you get your court date, we get you in or we get you out, than that way, than to say, I'm going to hold you in a facility forever.
So this, we kind of are talking a little bit about, the access to justice, access to counsel, and how important it is. One of the things to kind of put this in perspective, so in Stanford, more or less, there are 15 immigration attorneys, maybe a few more. But if it's 20, I'd be stunned. I think that's right. Would you agree with? Yeah. Immigration courts up in Hartford. I go to Hartford, that's half a day. That gets factored into what I charge. And I'm sorry, but it does. So an immigrant has a choice who's in removal proceedings. You hire an attorney close to you, knowing that you're going to pay for them to go to the hearing, or you hire an attorney that's closer to court, and then you're going to take that half day off every time you go to meet your attorney. It's a big burden on people. And so that's why having a pro bono service in Stanford is so vitally important. And so that's kind of the next part of the conversation really is, what does an attorney do? How does an attorney make things better, or in terms of making the system work, or at least giving the person an understanding of what's going on and access to what rights they may or may not have?
Right. I think it's the same way it does for anyone else in any other condition. Having an attorney is all the difference between having your case approved and actually receiving justice and being heard and just being dismissed. So in every situation, from actual encounter at the border to actual processing in immigration court to showing up for your court dates, because once again, the language challenges, right? They're going to send you a notice to some address via U.S. mail, which right now is sort of iffy, to tell you on a date to show up at a certain place, which pursuant to COVID may or may not be open, right, when you get there. that's the rough situation. But in all cases, from the American Bar Association and from the American Immigration Lawyers Association and the American Immigration Council, every study shows that if you have an immigration attorney, it changes the dynamics of your case. One, for you showing up in court, and two, for you getting a just result.
Yeah, I mean, it really is vitally important, and it's important that we are able to do that. That's why, actually, Jennifer and Adriana, would you guys mind standing up if they're in the room?
Oh, there.
Okay, excellent. So, yeah, we were talking about B1C's, access to legal representation. It's those two ladies. They're the directors. Adriana is the director of the benefits side, and Jennifer is the director of the removal defense side. So anyway, thank you both. Oh, if you've written down questions, which I hope you have, they're the ladies to hand them to. And you should probably do that now because we're getting close to winding up our part of the presentation. So anyway, they'll work their way around the room. This really is the key thing. Attorneys make a difference in the system. I was talking about that transcript of Judge Carté trying to explain the system to the 5-year-old. Attorneys are the ones who know how to make the cases work. If you have a viable case, they will help. If you don't have a viable case, you at least have a realistic assessment on that. And again, remember at the beginning when I said 90% of you probably would not have a viable immigration case. Now, some of you would be able to fight. And maybe during the course of that fight, because immigration court in Hartford is about a 4-year delay between your first hearing and your second hearing. So, and things come up and change, and so that will change things too. Some of you may have a case that's not quite ripe. And the example there that I want to give is kind of a reverse of what Lucas experienced. While he was going through his immigration case, or his parents were going through their immigration case, he aged out. He no longer was part of their case. There are situations where people will suddenly have they don't have a benefit yet, but they may in a year or 2 years. And so you may not have something you can do now, but given the court system and how the backlogs that they look at, maybe that's what you do. But even that's not exactly justice. Untimely justice really doesn't help anyone. We could talk about other areas of immigration law where the backlogs are also horrific, and some of the insanity that it ends up coming out. That's for another night. But that's really kind of the world that we need to live in. That's why we need to have changes in the immigration court system. So I think we're ready for questions.
Doug, can I say something?
Sure, yeah. Jump in.
I think it's also important to understand that as sort of we're building sort of legal services, it's important to also support community-based organizations that are working alongside or providing service to immigrant communities. As immigrants are trying to fight their case, as immigrants are going through this legal battle and these legal processes, they also need support in having to figure it out, sort of rent and jobs and et cetera. So it's important that we also support community-based organizations and the need for community-based organizations in our communities to support families as they're going through the removal proceedings. I think that's crucial as well.
Right. And as we sort of transition for me, one of the things I thought about, I am not Jewish, but I do, I have a lot of Jewish friends, and as we think about the new year, and then you also think about the celebration of Yom Kippur and Atonement, you also sort of think about the last wave of large refugees and what that meant to the world and what that meant to families that are here. And when you think about it from a personal perspective of how this country welcomed that class of people that has become this class of people in many cases, it shows you how life-changing it can be when it's very personal, and you think about what it means to you and to the community and exactly what you've done to the community. So that's the appropriate way that I feel about thinking about community and building and what it means to not shut the door on the person behind you. Because in that faith, you would want someone to receive you the same way you want to receive those others.
One of the things, we're talking about Welcoming Week, which actually starts tomorrow. We talk a lot about wanting immigrants to integrate into our society. We have to reach out to other people. We have to be welcoming. Think of when you first moved here. I did. I transplanted when I was 50. Well, no, I'm 50 now. I was 30-something then. It makes a big difference when someone says, "Hi, I'm Doug. And what's your name? How are you?" And someone who can say, "I can help. How can I help?" Actually, that's the one. How can I help? It's the question. That is how we bring people in, and that is how we welcome people, is we go to them and say, "How can we help?" And that's something that we need to, and make sure that they feel welcome and not scared. They're already scared enough. We're all scared. But we actually are coming from a position where we should be able to welcome them.
And I think in that same light, just moving down the scale a little bit,
Sorry.
you also need to understand that people have difficult lives and people come from difficult places and you meet people where they are. And maybe someone did steal something at some point. Maybe they were hungry, right? Maybe someone had an infraction with the law. Who in here hasn't had a speeding ticket? Are you obviously now you're a speeder for the rest of your life, or were you a speeder at that time? Right? So this sort of concept of the pure immigrant, when we're not even pure Americans, needs to be divorced and removed, specifically in the DACA arena, where we have over-policing of Black and brown communities that it leads them to exclusion. So all of these judgment moments that we sort of have, I ask us to also reflect on our lives when we were in high school or wherever we were. And I was the good one, so I was telling on you. I don't drink, I don't smoke, so I can get away with it. No, I'm kidding. Everybody has something. But in that moment of reflection, you should understand that people have difficult circumstances that they go through, and that everybody deserves a little bit of grace. And I think that that's what is important in an immigration arena, and that when the community tells you this person's a criminal because they stole something to eat, or whatever it was, I don't even know what it could be, or they used a little bit of marijuana, right? If your kid or your community, does that make them a pothead? I feel like those overlaying judgments that we bring upon people who we're just meeting and we don't know their circumstances doesn't feel right to me in any sort of statute, specifically in a community, because you need to be able to say, well, wait a minute, that could be me. And I think in this world of COVID, we get to experience that, where things are happening around us, and you go, well, that could have been me. And then when it happens to you, think, well, wow, it is me, right? This is my moment. And have that same level of reflection, and it'll help you it helps me grow, right?
It is kind of the whole thing of, let me explain. We've all had that moment. Usually in my household, it was about 30 seconds after the ball went through the window and mom or dad came out and you're holding the bat. Well, let me explain. But that's what it is. We should be able to explain. And that's not the way the system works right now. There's no explanation. It is black or it is white. You are done or you are in. And that's not right. So do we have questions? They're coming.
One of the things that I think it's important for us to understand is the need to have like a culture shift in us thinking about immigration. Immigration obviously has been weaponized in the political arena, and as we think about immigrants, how do we get to a point where we're thinking about immigrants as part of our community, as one of us, instead of a guest in our communities? Because at the minute in which you were sort of thinking about a person or a family as guests into your community, it's at that point where you start othering them, or sort of containing them in this container, and they have these sorts of privileges as guests and not certain others. And so it's important for us to have this culture shift in society and how we think about immigrants, not just as guests, but fully integrated as one of us and as part of the community, fully integrated.
I'm Jennifer Williams. I'm the new Removal Defense Director here at B1C. I started about a month ago. I'm thrilled to be here. I did removal practice in New York with the Legal Aid Society for a very long time. And so I come from a very spoiled jurisdiction where there are a lot of resources for individuals who are in removal proceedings. And to be part of this process here in Connecticut for Stanford is such an honor, because there's such a great need. So we're going to kind of go back and forth with the questions that you all have proposed to us, and they're really, really good questions. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, and I'm Adriana Podesta. I've been with B1C for 4 years plus, and I'm thrilled that now we have somebody in the removal area and department, because that's a big need too. And yes, thank you for being here and all your help to B1C, because we can help because you help. And yes, I don't know if I want to go first. There are a lot of interesting questions, all of them. Okay, it's here. Do current immigration reform proposals include reforms in the immigration and appeal court system? And so, which ones?
They do not. They do not. There's no, I mean, we have proposals. The ABA's drafted something. The American Immigration Bar has drafted something, but right now they haven't. The main things that they're sort of looking for in immigration right now is funding, and to address just a small population of DACA holders, TPS holders, that portion of the undocumented population. So no. But we have drafts ready. So if you're a congressperson, I can slip you something.
Allen, you mentioned earlier that there's no constitutional right to counsel. And so who should be paying for the lawyers? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it on just the community, pro bono organizations? Whose responsibility is that? And how do we make it happen?
So I think responsibility might be an odd word to use, but I think that there's an ought involved in it. And I think that you'll see that when you think about Maine, where you sort of see the population has sort of aged and now there are not people there anymore to do the day-to-day labor because they got old and nobody wants to live in Maine and there are no jobs there. So building community. So I think it isn't so much about obligation, it's about the ought of community and society. So just like we pay taxes to get other things done, it's also part of the security system to vet and make sure these people have the right sort of process to be here and able to build in this country, right? So if you think about that in the same way you think about other court systems or even the healthcare system, we don't ask who all is to pay for whatever, right? So I think when the concept comes to money, it's not about how much does it cost, it's about is there the will.
Yes, this question touches on the fact that we hear on the news and we watch the news of what is going on in the border or what immigration is doing to this country. So two things. How can we help dispel, or what is a short answer we can give to people that have the wrong perception, or how can we also get the right information?
Yeah, so one of the question is, well, how do you deal with someone who says it feels like an invasion? Because that's what you hear in the news every day, right? And I say to you, do you feel invaded? Because now I'm in Stanford. I came all the way from Georgia, actually, Georgia, DC, now I'm here. Just changing things every day. I was just looking at, need a stop sign on the end of Main Street. No, so I feel the concept is one of finding the foundation of the conversation to build from. And it can't start with, everybody gets in or everything's wrong, is to say, oh, do you enjoy community? I enjoy community. Do you care about women and children? I care about women and children. Find the basis that you can use the building blocks to sort of build on. Don't start with the big picture. Because if you're yelling at each other, you're not having a communication and you're not helping with the conversation. And part of what, I'm in a friendly space, so I'll be honest with you. I have an article that's out about this anyway. One of the things that happened after 9/11 is we started to fear immigrants and we started to fear certain religions. Right? Not the people who did it, but all of them. And if you think about it in that way, if Connecticut did something wild and crazy, then we all started hating everybody from Connecticut. That doesn't really make sense, right? You would hate the individual who actually did something, not the whole group of people. We were in a 20-year war about that. So part of the conversation needs to be moving away from it's a group of people to dealing with individuals and saying, I'm not talking about what's going on there. I'm talking about this person who's before me, who's asking for help because they have this situation. And then it becomes that humanitarian question with regards to, women and children and their rights and reproduction and freedom. Totally can have that conversation. Well, then the person says, you know what? Let's be a libertarian. Let's have a libertarian conversation, cost-benefit analysis. People are dying from COVID, and Americans are dying, and we're not reproducing at the same level we were before. So we need new people in these societies. Point blank, period. Nothing. When you think about the natural disasters that just happened in Louisiana and here on the East Coast, who do you think is going to rebuild those places? You, me, with my law degree? No, right? So the concept of saying we need workers and then saying we don't want you isn't a very consistent conversation and isn't a very smart one.
Lucas, earlier you spoke about how you were afraid to, talk to the police or call the police if there was ever, an issue where you needed to call 911, which I think raises another issue of surveillance in our communities by ICE and DHS. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the way that ICE and DHS does conduct surveillance within the immigrant communities and what happens.
Yes. And I've been subject to a little bit of that as an activist myself and engaging in civil disobedience in front of immigration court. We see surveillance happening. We see surveillance happening in local communities, in train stations, right? There's or in airports. It's hard to say. There's not a single way that I can tell you this is how I surveils people, because it happens in obscure ways. And we've seen activists and community organizers who are in the immigrants' rights movement be targeted. We've seen families be targeted, or even, to tell you a story. So my aunt in Brazil went for an interview for a tourist visa, and one of the first questions they asked her was, "Who is Lucas Codognolla?" And so there is a lot of surveillance that's happening. When we apply, for example, for DACA, we share everything about our lives and everything. And so one of the things that was a really big issue in the past administration, as the past administration was trying to shut down the program, was the question of what will happen to all of the data that we've just collected on the 800,000 DACA recipients. So these are questions that come up, and we don't have answers to. And which is why it's so important to have sort of permanent policies in place to support immigrants that is humane and respects people's privacies and data. Because in the world that we live in today, there is a lot of breaches, right? And we don't know. We just don't know what the data is going to be used for. And so, which is also, this also plays into policy debates up in Hartford, here in the state, as we're looking to expand, for example, the Husky program for undocumented immigrants, or a driver's license. One of the big questions that we work with, that community-based organizations are working with policymakers, is to make sure that the data, is to make sure that immigrants are protected when they are applying for either municipal or state benefits as well.
To give you an idea as how much data is out there, and this is actually kind of a funny story. So I had a U.S. citizen who was petitioning for her son who was not a U.S. citizen, but he was in the U.S. coming up on the end of his work visa, and the timing all worked out. So he actually had his interview. He's nervous because he knows if he doesn't pass the interview, he goes home. So they're talking, and he's really nervous. His mom's kind of like, oh, well, whatever. And the officer turns to her and says, "We know about the mango incident." And the son was like, "What? Mango? What's going on?" She'd come into the United States and failed to declare that she had a mango in her suitcase. The officer just had that information there and was using it to kind of, I think he was trying to get the mom's attention and make sure that she took it seriously. But there's no question of the relationship, no question of eligibility. It was just an example of how much data we have. Anyway.
Interesting. Yes. Well, here's another question, probably for Allen. Is there a local, or could be Lucas, local political leaders at city-state level focused on immigration court, reform? And how can we affect change as local citizens?
So change as local citizen, voting. Voting, the key, is like the world for it. The issue becomes the same thing as the 5-year-old in immigration court when an immigration attorney starts talking to a layperson about immigration court. What do you mean? That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't sound like justice, and they don't believe it. And so what we're trying to do now is, one, show people what the court systems are, what the backlog is, what the expense is, and sort of running that way. So it is definitely a long-term plan. And we would love to speak to local officials about the problem that they're having with people in their community, because I think that's the important part to understand, that is your neighbor who's having the struggle to drive from Stanford to Hartford to get to a court system and then wait 4 more years to get another response, which to no one should that sound reasonable.
I would say also it's our duty to be civically engaged with local politics, municipal politics, as well as state politics, right? And so I don't know if any of you have ever gone to the Connecticut legislative website, but in every legislative session, it's the easiest thing to search bills, to see the bills that are coming up. You literally could put keywords: immigrants, refugees, any sort of keyword. And see the bills that are coming up. And then you can find out who's your local representative and local state representative and state legislator, and call them up and see, what do you think about this bill? Have you sponsored this bill? I think it's important for us to educate ourselves and be civically engaged and just ask. I think it's important for us to, as sort of we have primary elections coming up and municipal elections, ask our candidates, what will you do for the immigrant community here in Stanford? What is a welcoming community? What does a welcoming community look like for you? And how does that include immigrants? I think it's a valid question to ask any candidate.
Right, and a civics issue is that, immigration is a federal issue, so a state can't really do anything about immigration courts, but they can provide money and they can provide lawyers, and that's what you see California doing. You see a lot of places in the Midwest doing it, sort of stepping up saying, meat packing company areas of saying, we need these workers here, and it's important for us to have them here, so we're going to step up for them and pay this right, rather than have our companies closed down. And that's the cost-benefit analysis that sort of happens over time.
Okay, we had 2 questions about what's happening at the border. So this is fair game for everyone. What is happening with the migration protection protocols, and what does that mean for current asylum seekers? And then the second question is for the unaccompanied minors that are coming to the United States. Who's taking care of them? Where do they go? What do those facilities look like? How do they get out of them? And then what's the next step for those individuals?
So, either way.
So I think you just saw that the Biden administration made a rule that unaccompanied Afghanistan kids could come into the United States and be released to family members. So in most cases, what HHS is doing, which is Human Health Services, is trying to move the migrants through the system to their family members here. And that's important. In your mindset right now, know that almost every immigrant that appears at our border has some family member that is currently in the United States that is willing and able to take care of them so that we don't have to pay the detention costs. That's like ground level 1 in that conversation. And so that's what happened. All of the kids that were separated under the previous administration are down to maybe 400 of them not being relocated with either a family member or someone else of that sort. So they're out there. Because they were children in international law, we didn't get pictures of them, so we didn't get to see who they were and where they were and all those concerns, because, part of my mind was, are these small girls? Are these small boys? What are you doing with them? And who's taking care of them? Because in the private facilities, these small girls were being taken advantage of. And so for me, a girl is someone who's 16. So yes, girl. And it's against the law in most states. And that's part of the problems that you see from these private facilities, that they were sort of having street staffing. And what I mean by street staffing means people who were not degreed or didn't have a license to sort of take care of them. They took advantage of them. The conversation about the southern border and the Remain in Mexico policy is a very difficult one. And, I'm never going to live in Texas. I think Texas is the seat of all evil right now. And they basically took the Biden administration to court to say that this migrant protocol rule, which isn't even allowed. I mean, it's a policy that came up under the last administration that isn't even allowed under our own law, our own constitution, that says when you come to the United States, we are able to send you back to Mexico and we will process you from Mexico, right? And we already had rules out there from the State Department saying parts of Mexico aren't safe. So it didn't really make sense. And for people who are coming from the Caribbean or Africa or from Brazil to stand at the border who don't speak the language disenfranchises them to their right to justice, meaning they don't have access to a court, the right language. So currently, we are waiting to hear from the Mexican government, which we control them a lot of time by money, if they're going to allow us to have migrants remain in their country. What you saw in the law or news articles recently is that you saw that the Mexican police were actually attacking immigrants as they appeared at the Mexican border to keep them from moving through Mexico, which is against a human right violation for our country to participate in anyone doing those same type of violations, which, I say that loosely because we obviously don't care because we were separating women and children at the border and we all went to bed at night and we, it's fine, we'll get to them, whenever, right? But if we were separated from our dog, we'd be ready to go out and shoot somebody. So those sort of things, when we look about it and we think about who we become, that's part of the processing. The issue at the southern border is one of opening up the migration system. Once again, you're at a club, there's nobody inside, the music's blaring, and they just want everybody to stand outside to become a political issue. There are issues that are in that corridor, absolutely, in Central America, that we participated in creating, right? I mean, we have our foot, we took our white hat around the world solving problems as we did in Afghanistan, and a lot of times we had challenges that we were instituting a government that wasn't right for that particular place, right? And so what our government's doing now is they're trying to fix some of those problems, as well as address the issue at the push and the pull. Part of that is environmental, right? If the plants don't grow anymore and there's not any water, what are you gonna do, right? Think about California. You're either gonna steal all of Colorado's water or you're gonna move. And that's what's happening in Central America. People around the world, not just in Central America, people around the world are moving because the environment no longer sustains them because they can't grow and they don't have water. And that's just a human need. So there's some of that. Then there is the drug cartel and this understanding. And this is where I sort of wonder with my logic. The concept is that they make drugs in Mexico, because regardless of where you're from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, it doesn't matter, you're Mexican. If you speak Spanish, you're Mexican. And then they bring the drugs here, and they're bringing the drugs here by walking 1,000 miles in this billion-dollar business, right? And when they bring it here, we're such noble-bound people that we don't buy it. We don't have any participation in it. They're just bringing drugs here, right, constantly. We're not buying it or asking it for whatever. So part of me says, if you really want to address the push and pull of that problem, then you address part of the problem here, because if we weren't buying it, they wouldn't be selling it, and it wouldn't be coming across the border. So it's two unique issues. Part of it we can solve because we're American people, and this is where we can sort of take care of that. So the concept of people walking, think about that. I sometimes walk from downtown Stanford with my dog to the very top of the Shipping Park. I think that's far. But someone walks 1,000 miles with their kid, get on trains and deal with people they don't know, and they're coming to the border to sell you fentanyl? Doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, next question. This is for the three of you. What, in your view, should be the major pillars of good immigration policy? What would you prioritize first?
So I'll start. At the end of the day, it's a numbers game. And what I mean by that is the current system was basically set up with the numbers decades ago. The population is grown. The backlogs have grown. And part of it's because there are caps on how many people can come in. Allen mentioned that almost everyone who comes here has someone here who wants them here. Either if it's a business immigration case, it's a business that wants them here. If it's a family immigration case, it's a family member that wants them here. And it can be a decade or longer to go through that line. The only way to fix that is to increase the number of people who can come into the United States. That's my number one priority, and that would, followed closely by a second one, which is give discretion back to immigration judges.
I think for me, I would say, I'm not an attorney by trade, obviously, but I think we need a system that's humane and dignifies people. I think we need to have an internationalist understanding of immigration and not just a domestic policy understanding of immigration, understanding forced migration, understanding environmental causes, understanding the pulls and pushes of immigration patterns, because whatever policy that we create now will impact future migration patterns that we know that will just keep becoming bigger because of climate change and other reasons. And so for me, it's I wouldn't prioritize a group, but I think about how do we, again, have a culture change, a narrative shift around migration, for us to understand that it's an international problem and not just a domestic policy problem. And how do we make sure that any policy that we have is not a Band-Aid like DACA that puts people in this limbo status, but it's permanent and it allows people to live their lives and live in communities here in the United States.
So I'm a spiritual person, and so I'll just base it in this. I think that we should run the government like we would run our religious facilities. And if people are coming and they're coming for the right reason, you make a bigger place because people are doing the same celebration, they're doing the same building, they're in the same platform that you're in, right? They're doing the same thing you are doing. No one in the religious sort of facility goes, well, there's too many people here, right? They're not, because if they're in your room, in your space, following your same pattern, then those are people who are celebrating you. And it makes it bigger and better every time. And the concept that it's a very Western one, it's a very today one, of if somebody gets something that I don't get it, needs to be removed. Because in most communities, we understand that the more people that come, the bigger the community becomes, and the more jobs that sometimes become available. Look at New York City. I mean, that is the New York City model, right? That there were people that were there, more people came, more jobs were created, it became this big industry. The same thing with California. And I think that when you start thinking about it, when you don't think about it as a problem, but as an opportunity, that we can move in the right direction. Fixing the numbers is important. Fixing the concepts is important. Fixing immigration courts important. But one of the things that you can't, I'll tell you what it is. It's student debt. It's this problem that we have saddled ourselves to for decades that brings you into poverty in your senior years. We need to resolve the current immigration problem, saying, you know what, we've dealt with this 11 million people so many times. They've been here all this time. We're going to just end this. Here's a pathway. We're done with that. The issue with that becomes the Ronald Reagan problem of saying, well, he did that before, and then after that, more people came, right? Well, after that, we can deal with a better issue. We have a better situation for doing that. It's a better way to matriculate people through by changing the numbers and changing the platform. You will be amazed, and I've done the studies through the reports, that most of the people who come in at the southern border don't really want to stay here. They're just looking for refuge for a period of time or for a job. They want to go home. So if they could come for the summers and then go home, they would do that. No issue.
That is one of the things of unintended side effects. So I started practicing in 1997, right after the major immigration law changes. One of the things, before that, people would come and they would go because there was no penalty and relatively low cost. After 1997, it got so hard to come, it got so expensive to come, they came and they didn't go. And so, it was just, people being rational. I have to come here, make money so I can send money home to help the kids. I need to make money so I can send it home to my community. You have entire communities that are, the remittances to Mexico are the biggest foreign aid the U.S. gives to Mexico. These people were just looking to take care of their own. And we set up a system that encouraged them to stay here. And 20 years later, the proof is there, and we still can't get over that. We can't get over the idea that, now we're not going to be punishing them anymore. We need to stop punishing people. Sorry.
This was a comment from an audience member about how respondents can be detained and often hundreds of miles away from their family members and from their counsel, making representation more challenging. So it would be interesting to know what happens to somebody in the Stanford community or in Connecticut if they are detained by ICE. What detention facility do they go to? Where is it? How do they gain access to counsel?
So the good news is it's not as far away as it used to be. It's now only in Massachusetts. There was a period of time where they would ship people all over the country. But that's what happens. There are no detention facilities in Connecticut at all. There's one in Massachusetts. There are, I think, 3 law firms in Connecticut that will that will take detained cases on a regular basis because of that. Because if you think about it, it's going up to detention facility to see your counsel, to see your client is expensive. And a lot of, and it's time consuming. So you're talking about with immigration attorneys, most of us are solos. Even the ones who work in firms tend to be nested within the firm rather than an integrated practice. So there just aren't many firms that have the capacity to be able to go to Massachusetts to interview a client.
Okay, this question is somewhat related to that and related to what Anka said about the percentage of success in a case, like 4% without representation and 48% with a lawyer. So the question is, what is the cost for a client to basically take the odds to 50-50 to win their cases?
So that's kind of like going to a taking your car to a mechanic, or not taking your car to the mechanic, calling up the mechanic and saying, my car has a problem. How much is it going to cost to fix? Every case is different. Every immigration case is different, even in removal proceedings. There's a big difference between an asylum case and a case where you are, someone's eligible to get the green card in proceedings. They just ended up in proceedings before they were able to file the green card. There's a big difference between someone who's a permanent resident who is fighting a deportation case and someone who has never been a permanent resident who is fighting a deportation case. You are probably looking, well, personally, I think I'd be surprised if it's less than $10,000 in pretty much any matter. But, you pick more, it can go up pretty easily, unless it's pro bono.
If all of you can have your wish granted, what is the one thing that you would change about our immigration laws? Just one. And that wish can be granted.
Well, I'll take immigration court, so now you figure something out.
So actually, one of the things, this gets a little bit to numbers. Our legal immigration system, our lawful immigration system, it's a sponsorship-based system. And I actually don't have any real problems with that. But it is heavily weighted towards education and not trades and not essential workers. They have no real viable options. There are a few, some narrow options that occasionally you might be able to take some advantage of, but they're expensive, they're complicated, they're short-term, they're long-term, but there's no short-term possibility in there. We really need to have a system that has paths for every type of job.
So I would do immigration. I would say immigration record, sort of getting that reform in there. But I think in this community, in this space, I will also say this: there are parts of your community that are South Asian, Indian nationals, who also are waiting, who came, did everything the right way, and are also waiting 10 to 20 years to get their green card just because they're Indian nationals. And it's something that started in 1965, and we thought we were doing something right. And of course, nothing's more discriminatory than that very process, but also realize that in a very real sense that, if they were from any other country, that their kids would get benefits and wouldn't have to wait so long. And that's problematic in our system. So doing the court system and then pulling all that racism and discriminatory practice out of the system would be super important for me.
And for me, I would just say the ability to go back to your home country and visit your family members as an immigrant.
Dang, that's a good one.
This is a question about the $3.5 trillion spending plan. Mm-hmm. Apparently contains some kind of path to residency. So what aspects, what part of how to become a resident? What is immigration related about that plan, and what is the likelihood of that being passed?
I would almost let the Beltway attorney answer the question of what's the likelihood. So Alan mentioned it before. It's really only narrow fixes. Again, we kind of are fixated on, let's take care of this class, this class, this class. And people who have this characteristic, and this characteristic. That, I mean, that's, if you're going to do very little, that's better than doing nothing, but it's actually not resolving the problem. What they're really looking at is dealing with long-term TPS, people who've had TPS for 20 years plus, dreamers, DACA recipients, and essential workers. It's very better than nothing, but at the end of the day, it's not even a Band-Aid. It's just, you know, making some very low-level choices. For the odds, Alan, I defer to your judgment. Probably Lucas, you guys would probably know more about the political odds.
Well, first you have to call Joe Manchin. First you need to call Joe Manchin and see where he is today. Then you would need to talk to the Senate parliamentarian to see if they're going to allow it to be part of the reconciliation bill based on the rules. So I think it's, you know, it's 50-50. I think the American people are behind it. Today there were 7,000 different religious and unions that sort of got behind the bill. It's the most movement I've had in my practice of immigration, and I know I look incredibly young, but I've been doing this for like 20 years. So
since he was 5.
Yeah. So I think we are very much inside of getting something done. And I believe that the Biden administration has this as part of their burn list to get through to the midterm. So I think that it will happen. I think that Joe Manchin will move. I don't think the bill may be the $3 trillion. It'll come down somewhat, but I think immigration will be included, and it may just be the DACA and the Dreamers. Yeah.
So I've been tasked with watching the time, and it's time. But I want to thank all of you for coming. It was great to actually see you all in person, to talk with you, to hear your questions. I want to thank Alan and Lucas. They're amazing. And I hope that you walk away sitting there thinking you had an amazing night. Good evening.